What's up, Resonate? Good to see you guys. Good to be here with you. Today we get to continue with this epic story of walking through what it means for us to be connected to what God's been doing for the last 2,000 years with the church, and thinking about the movement. We've been in this since January, really talking about, hey, what does this look like for us to continue to walk towards this, to continue to see how we got here and what this looks like. And over the last few weeks, as I've been thinking about this, I've been just preparing and reading through some stuff. And one of the things that has been really interesting, I read an article that basically said, as we look at the statistics and we look at kind of people who follow all of these really kind of polls of how people participate in this thing called church, the statistics tell us that in terms of mainline denominations, there's only about 23 more years left until that decline that's been happening for about 20 years goes to zero. And that's a big deal. And they're saying, this is around Easter when they talked about this, that in the next, there's only 23 more Easters left for mainline denominations, which means this, that for some of you, you'll see the church radically change. For others of you, your children will see that. And so when we begin to think about what is upon us, that the fact is that what the church has looked like for the last 2,000 years is in our lifetime or in our children's lifetime going to radically change. And I hope that helps us to understand how this is important to hear and really what it means for us to really ask, what is it that we need to be doing in this kind of context? Here's the good news. If that's the bad news, that the church is radically going to change, the good news is that from the very beginning, the church has had a DNA in it that has withstood persecution, that has withstood cultural change, that has withstood all kinds of crazy stuff for the last 2,000 years. And when we begin to see a decline in something, we know that likely that may not be connected to what God intended or Jesus established in the very beginning of this story called the Christian church. And so we get to, over the last few weeks, we've been just asking, what is the intent of God? What did he establish? How is this connected to something that's bigger than just us? And so here we are. We find ourselves in Acts 17 looking at this. And I'm glad you're here. And I want you to think about this in really a bigger sense, is asking the question, how did you get here? And I'm not asking the question about this in terms of an idea of the car you got in here or the way you walked to church or whatever that looked like. But really, like, what are all the pieces of the puzzle that led you to being in this spot, in this moment, as we talk through this content? I think in my life, all the different things that were moments of choosing one way and not the other way. And I think about the people that intersected my life in those moments. And when I look back at how I'm here in this moment, in this context, there are people in my life that intersected my life. And if it weren't for those people, I would not be here. And maybe they don't realize it, and for some of them, I've gone back and said, hey, it's because of you that I'm in this place. But if you look back, and I was thinking back, I arrive as a freshman in college, and I show up at this event, and I mainly show up at this event to please my parents, and I told them that I would go to this Christian event, and so I go to this thing, and I show up, and it was incredibly lame, but I'm a freshman, and I don't have anything else to do later, and so I'm just hanging around, and the guy who's the leader said, hey, we could have some help putting up chairs, and so I thought, I have nothing going on, so I picked up a chair, and I began to put it up, and I began to, in the process of hanging around a little bit later, meet people. One of the people that I met was a guy who was an upperclassman and began to take me under his wing and begin to introduce me to incredibly legit guys that were legit followers of Jesus. And I began to realize that the idea that I had about following Jesus was nothing of what it actually meant to be a disciple of Jesus. And it just radically changed my life. And I think about where I was heading. And if not for that moment and that conversation and that guy saying, hey, come over to my house, we're having a bonfire, and I'm meeting all these guys that are just amazing people on campus, and beginning to realize I had no clue about this. Like, if not for that conversation, if not for that night potentially to be able to intersect that, then my life might have been radically different. And there's people as I graduated college that said, hey, why don't you move up to the Northwest? And it's this random collection of this happened and this happened and this happened, and all of a sudden here I am. And then I'm in the Portland area finishing up my seminary degree, and all of a sudden someone sees in my life something that they say, hey, we need to actualize this and have a conversation at Marie Callender's over pie. And this guy says, what about going to Washington State University? It could have been a different person. All of these things led up to the context of my life right now. And I begin, and I believe that each of you have moments where you made a decision. But what I want to talk about today is the people that were connected to those moments. And the people in your life that intersected your life at just the right time, in just the right moment, to say just the right things, and helping you to have something that radically changed your life. And what we get to see is a moment in Scripture where Paul is going to a context, and along the way, he kind of gets distracted, and he ends up in a city called Athens. So he's in Thessalonica, and then he goes on to Berea, but ultimately he's heading someplace else, and he's just having a stopover in Athens. And this stopover in Athens is really for him to wait for a couple of traveling partners. But while he's there, we see a moment in the book of Acts, in this story of the movement of the gospel. And likely this is one of the most significant stories, or at least the most researched stories in the entire book of Acts. And so I fought Matthew and Josh to be able to talk to you about this today. So here I am, and here we get to talk about this. And so I want to get into this. And as you can see, I'm doing a little something different on the screens. I'm just giving you my entire notes. We're going to walk through this, and maybe this will be something a little bit creative for us to go through. So as we think about this, and we look at this in Acts chapter 17, verse 16, what we begin to see is this idea. While Paul was waiting for them, he's waiting for them in this context. And I want you to get this, that in this process, that this wasn't Paul's destination. This was Paul just being there, and he's just kind of hanging out in this city of Athens. And this is this moment where we get to see that this wasn't an intentional thing, that this wasn't something that was a planned idea. This was just off the cuff. This was just him being him. This might be the most just raw, unfiltered version of Paul that we get to see, because it was just him having a moment that he didn't expect to have, because he was just there hanging out. Have you ever waited somewhere, and all of a sudden you're waiting somewhere and something happens and you didn't expect that to happen, but it just you didn't see it coming, but you begin to engage it. It says he was waiting for them in Athens. And what I love is this idea that when it comes to us being people, that we go back to the very beginning, right? Jesus says, here's the thing, I want to give you a purpose for your life. It's beyond your job, it's beyond your vocation. I want to give you a purpose, and that purpose is to be someone who takes the good news of what I've done on this earth, and you get to be part of the purpose of spreading this thing. And oftentimes we can think about this in terms of the religious context in our life versus the secular context in our life. But from the very beginning, we have to understand that this permeated everything, that this wasn't just something I did, this is something that I am. And in this, as we begin to see Matthew 28:19, we call this the Great Commission, where Jesus says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, right? It kind of mimics this idea from the very beginning of the story, where he says, hey, I want you to go, and I'm going to give you power, and you're going to be my witnesses, and that's going to be across the entire earth. This is where the end story is. And so as you begin to look at the Greek, this idea of go, it's really the word going, or as you are going. If we begin to think about what this means, it means this, that as you live your life in the normal aspects of your life and just the regular part of your life, that as you look towards being someone who connects the regular part of your life to the purpose of God, this is where the magic happens. This is where you transform lives, because it's not just in the thing that you think about, hey, I want to have this conversation with someone, or I'm going to make this big decision in my life. Oftentimes, where you see God show up is the places that you never expected him. In this, Athens isn't his destination, but engaging people with the gospel is just his standard operating procedure. It's out of the overflow of his life that he was so connected with God that what happens is he just begins to respond It's an impulse, a missional impulse that he begins to have. And I love this. And he goes there, and quickly as we begin to see this, he engages Athens. And one of the things I love about this is that as he engages Athens, Athens is the equivalent of what we have today, especially as we are here in these university towns. And Athens would be the ancient equivalent of the modern university context. It was a place where ideas are formed. And one of the things that I love about our church is we plant churches across university towns in the Northwest, is that we're going to the places where the ideas are formed. And as we begin to live out the missional impulse, as we begin to say, hey, because of what God has done for me, I can't help but to be a light to the world around me, that begins to infiltrate the most strategic places on earth, these places where the ideas that are formed that affect society. And this is why we're here. And this is why we do what we do, because it's a leverage point to affect the rest of the world. And so we get to see this. And it says this as he goes on. It says, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. I want you to get this idea of being greatly distressed. Man, this is something that we rarely have Paul having these emotive words. And if we begin to peer into this is, you might use the word infuriated or like deeply hurt. This idea of greatly distressed. He walks into town, and it says that in Athens you could find more gods than men. It was easier to find a god than it was a man, because there was all these gods and there's all these idols. There were all these shrines that were built to towards these different gods. And I could name off all these gods, but there was just tons and tons of God. Maybe if you understand just like the Greek understanding of gods and goddesses, then you might be able to understand what he walked into and what he saw in this. And what he saw was something that really was distressing to him. This was something that really ultimately caused him to feel something in his heart. And this is a key part of this, because what it says is this: he saw that the city was full of idols. And when we look at the word idol, and we think about the word idol, oftentimes that doesn't connect to us, and that doesn't connect to what it means for us to live in this modern society. We don't talk about that in the same way. There's not as overt kind of idols, but a guy named Timothy Keller, who's a pastor in New York, he says this. He says, "What is an idol? It is anything more important to you than God, anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God, anything you seek to give you what only God can give you. An idol is whatever you look at and say in your heart of hearts, if I have that, then I'll feel my life has meaning. Then I'll know that I have value. Then I'll feel significance and I'll feel significant and secure." There are many ways to describe that kind of relationship to something, but perhaps the best one is worship. So when we begin to think about understanding what Paul walks into, what he sees is a group of people who are putting their significance and putting their security in something that will ultimately never get them to that destination that they so deeply desire. He walks in and sees that these people are deeply hoping for something to change their life, that they're hoping that something would ultimately help them to get where they're going. And he begins to realize this is not going to get them there. This is just stone and metal. And these things behind this have no power to affect our lives at all. It's a little bit more subtle for us. But there's some things that I think are really similar. When we think about, he wrote these 20 questions about what is it that if I have this, then I'll ultimately have me. Just 20 questions to ask ourselves in terms of idolatry that is not just in terms of those physical things, but for us more in terms of things that were beneath the surface. It says this, life has meaning, or I'm only worth if I have this. If I have power and influence over others, power idolatry. If I'm loved and respected by this person, this approval idolatry. If I have this kind of pleasure experience or a particular quality of life, and we have comfort idolatry. If I'm able to get mastery over my life in this area, we have control idolatry. If people are dependent upon me and they need me, we have helping idolatry. If someone is there to protect me and keep me safe, dependence idolatry. If I'm completely free from obligations or responsibilities to take care of someone, we have this deep desire for independence idolatry. If I'm highly productive and I get a lot of stuff done, we have work. If I'm being recognized for my accomplishments, if I'm excelling at work, we have this achievement. If I have a certain level of wealth or financial freedom and very nice possessions, we have materialism. If I'm adhering to my religion's moral codes and accomplished in its activities, we have religion. We have this one person in my life, and happy to be there or happy with me. We have individual person idolatry. If I feel I'm totally independent of organized religion, I'm living by my self-made morality. We have irreligion idolatry. My race and my culture is ascendant and recognized as superior. Racial idolatry. We have independent social grouping or professional grouping or other groups let me in. We have this inner ring idolatry. My children and my parents are happy and happy with me. We have family idolatry. That Mr. or Mrs. Right, Mr. or Mrs. Right is in love with me. Relationship idolatry. I'm hurting. I'm in a problem. Then only then do I feel I'm able to deal with the guilt. We have suffering idolatry. My political or social cause is making progress and ascending in influence or power. I have a particular kind of look or body image. See, this is way more than just statues in a courtyard. Now, what Paul is talking about is that thing that we put before God. If only I have this, then I'm going to be okay. And if only I get this, then I'm going to be okay. There's so many things that we could say, if only this, man, that will make me happy. And the difficulty is when he sees that, here's what he understands and here's what he knows. That as he goes and he sees these temples, and as he sees these places, that these are never going to get them there, that it's never going to be this place. And so ultimately what he does is he begins to engage this. And the question we have to ask ourselves is when we look around at our culture, do we see the idols? Do we see these things? Do we see these in our lives? Because this is so key for us, because we could be blinded by this thing that says, if I have this, I don't need God. If I just have power, if I just have money, if I just have sex, if I just have control, I just have him or her or security. What is that thing? And if we'd say, I'd rather have that than God, then Paul begins to help us to understand. And then the other thing is this, is that when we begin to look around, and he says this, when we look around at our culture, and not only just ourselves, what do we see? And here's where we have to ask ourselves, does that make us angry? Are we greatly distressed? If we were to identify, I love this more than God, my behavior would tell me that I desire this. I spend more time doing this. I have more thought energy that's put into this than my Heavenly Father. Does that make us distressed? When we see the world around us, the people that we work with, the people that we live around, and we see them pointed in their lives to these idols, are we greatly distressed? Or do we shrug our shoulders and say, I guess that's just their choice. Hope that works out for them. Paul says, there's a great distress that I am under because of this. And let me say that underneath that, that's love. That's love. And so here's what he does. He says, verse 17, so he reasoned in the synagogue with both the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day, with those who happen to be there. So what happens is he does what he typically does, and he goes to people that have a similar worldview. But then he doesn't stop there. He goes to the marketplace. And this was a common theme. It's not just, in the checkout line at Walmart, right? He's not being a creeper, right? So this is a cultural place that he's going to. And he's saying, I want to engage them. My heart is breaking for them because there's something that they believe that's ultimately going to be a dead end in their life. And I want to go and engage them with the truth of this gospel. It says this, and while he was there, happened to be there, a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. And some asked And some of them ask, what is this babbler trying to say? Epicurean and Stoic philosophy would be two distinctly different things. Epicurean would be a hedonism. You obey all the desires of your heart. A Stoic would be the opposite of that you deny all of those things. And each of these things, he's saying, they're radically different, but there is something that's put into there, this truth that makes everyone frustrated. That when we begin to bring the truth of the exclusivity of Christ and the truth of what God has intended, that every other philosophy begins to find that offensive. Here's what they say. What is this babbler trying to say? The literal translation of this, in the word babbler, is like a chicken that picks up something from the ground and tries to eat it and then spits it right back out. Here's what he's saying. You're just gathering all these bits and pieces of information, and then you're just kind of taking them and you're just kind of giving them back to us. Like really that he's a second-rate mind. That really he doesn't understand really what he's talking about. And here's this, the guy who writes the epic, Romans treatise, right, of just clarifying Scripture. This is what he's getting called, is he's a babbler to them. And I need us to understand, especially in academic settings, that when we bring in just the truths of God, do not expect for everyone just to believe, oh, wow, that's well thought through. That even just the reality of who God is and the otherness of God and the fact that God has to be big enough to be worshiped, and that big enough to be worshiped oftentimes makes it difficult for us to fully wrap our minds around it. And so we explain a God that we cannot comprehend, and as we explain something we cannot fully comprehend but is capable for us to worship, right? Then there's always going to be people to say, that doesn't make sense. I don't fully understand that. Are you sure that you're thinking that through, right? That's always going to come at us. It says this, others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus where they said, may we know what this new teaching that you are presenting. You mean that you're bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. See, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking and listening to the latest ideas. This was the center of the formation of thought. Even at that time, Athens was far from its prime, but even in the Roman Empire, this is one of the most important cities for the development of thought that transformed societies. And they're bringing in Paul. So he says this, so Paul stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus. This is people of Athens. I see that in every way you are very religious. And if we think about what this looks like, here's a picture of the Areopagus. It's an outcropping of the rock. And to think about this, that if you were to look at that and see, it could be that this is right around where Paul would have been standing, right? And all these people are gathered around listening to what is happening there as Paul begins to speak of the gospel to these people who have no clue, no background in this. And we get to see what it is as he begins to clarify this. And what we see when he speaks to them, it says this, I see in every way that you are very religious. And what we need to understand as he looks at this, that communicating the gospel has to start in a place of agreement. So what he's doing is he's bringing the gospel in there, and what he's starting with is he's being invited into this. See, so may we know, they're asking to know the gospel. They're asking to say, tell me more of this idea of who Jesus is and the resurrection. And when we begin to live our life, we cannot be the guy who comes to the campus with the megaphone and the offensive signs, right? Those people never get brought into the center of culture. So what we have to be able to see is to live in a context that the culture begins to invite you deeper. This is living a legitimate life. Being a plus one, not a negative one in the society, and to be able to say, we want to know more about that. That's interesting. As you begin to speak of this, I want to know more about this. It says this, it starts off in a place of connection. And so to the Athenians, what is he saying? You desire the right thing. You're desiring the right thing. That all around you, I see that there's something that's going on in your heart. That there's something that's going on in your mind where you desire to know what it is to have truth and to have clarity, right? That there's a longing in your heart. And what he does later is he says that's put there by God. But here's what's happening. As you begin to fill that, you're filling that legitimate need in an illegitimate way. See, here's what sin is. When we talk about sin, sin is finding something that only God should give us in something else. This is idols, right? It's dead ends. It's empty. We begin to say, if I only get much, this much more power or this much more control or this much more money, and it's continue. The carrot is out in front of you. If you just get more and more and more and more, always leading you to dead ends. But here's the thing. It is always based in your heart of a legitimate need. So anytime I sit down with someone, right, or I process with my children or in my own life, man, the reason I chose something other than God, I want you to know, I know something about you, every single one of you and me, that there's something in you that is the legit desire, that there's something in you, that there's a need that you have for something. The problem is you're trying to take and fill that need that you have with something that will never ultimately meet that need. It's a legitimate need filled in an illegitimate way. So this is why we have compassion on people. We don't say, you're going to hell, right? We're saying, hey, there's something there that you think is going to get you there, but it won't. That's why he's greatly distressed, right? And he begins to say, hey, out of my great distressed feelings that you have, that you're trying to get something that will never get you there, right? You're trying to go down a road that's going to be a dead end, that you'll never get there. I want to express to you, let me tell you this. It says, for I walked around and I looked carefully at your objects of worship. I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing that you worship, but I'm going to tell you this. I love coming into context and having those moments where you begin to tell somebody about Jesus who has a radical misunderstanding about Jesus, about what the church is, for people who thought the church was just full of people that were hypocrites, that were just trying to be good enough, that you're just trying to do your best to please God, and all of a sudden to talk to them about grace, to talk to them about this reality that you can try your whole life to be good, but you're never going to be good enough. That Jesus paid the penalty of your sin, and that you saying yes to Jesus covers your sin and allows you to have access to all that is good and to the relationship with your holy heavenly Father. And to have someone say, I've never known that before. I didn't realize I've been working really hard to be good enough to try to control my life, and you're telling me that I have to let it go and let God run my life, and he can do a way better job, and ultimately he has paid everything that allows me to have that relationship with him. And all of a sudden, it's just eyes light up. Last week, and even this week, we get to see stories of people who said, hey, this is who I am, and I decided to follow Jesus, and this radically changed my life. And the lighting up of people's eyes when they said it. This is what Paul is saying. It's distressed because I get to see this, and now I'm going to proclaim this. And so we see this is these idols. Here's where this is a legitimate need, but I cannot allow you to continue with this legitimate need and not have that met in a legitimate way. See, this is where we have to stand up. And this is where it's really difficult sometimes, that we kind of do this live and let live. And live and let live is about the most hateful thing that you can do for people. Because when we say you're going to go down a dead end, and I'm just going to let you go down that dead end, that we work together, we hang out together, whatever. And ultimately, I know that your life is pointed towards the rat race, the American dream, and you think at some point that's going to be there, that you're on your second marriage, and you think that somehow if you just get the right husband or the right wife, that this is going to work out, or if you get the right job or the right girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever it is, you think that. And if you don't address that, this is just one of the most hateful things that people that know the truth of the gospel can do, is to live and let live. So what does he do? He replaces the idols with the truth of the gospel. He says, I can't allow you just to continue to do this. And you have this unknown God. Let me tell you what this means. So he connects the questions of the culture to the answers of the gospel. And what I love about this is he takes and he connects the gospel. If you read through all the different times that Paul begins to tell about who Jesus is, and this movement begins to take off from the very beginning. When he talks to Jewish people, he's saying it this way. But when he talks to this group of Athenians, this group of Hellenists, this group of Greek people, he's doing it radically different. And for us, when we begin to think about this, we have to look into the eyes and the hearts of people and to listen to their needs and to be able to say, how does the gospel meet those needs? Because it's different. When we think about whatever that idol is, there's a truth that needs to be put into that. And here's where church oftentimes gets the bad rap, because we are telling people things that they're not asking. That church becomes irrelevant when it's solving problems or answering questions that no one is asking. And so from the very beginning, this is one of the texts that we built Resonate Church around, trying to say we've got to answer the relevant questions to this generation. We've got to say, hey, this is what the Bible says about you and your desire to find purpose in this life, that your desire to find the right mate, to find the right job, to be able to accelerate into a place of being satisfied beyond your wildest dreams. But the gospel has to answer that for it to be worthy for us to be able to press into this. It says this, he begins to talk to this. It says, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth. He does not live in temples built by human hands. And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. This is something that's right. He said, you're thinking that this is in this thing. But the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth. You've just got to understand how great this God is. And you're looking at these stone and gold and silver idols, and for us, it's a little bit more subtle, but we're looking at these things, and someone has to tell us, to whisper in our ear, the thing we think will be ultimately satisfied is really not going to satisfy us. It's the God who made the earth and everything in it, the Lord of heaven and earth, and he does not live in the temples built by hands. And he is not served as we can give him anything. He gives everyone life and breath. And here's what he does. He exposes the dead end. He says, this is not going to work for you. And every time I have a conversation with someone and we get into a philosophical conversation about what is God, and if they say, this is kind of what I believe, here's the question is, I just always ask, is that working for you? Is that working for you? And as we have the conversation, it's almost never working. And that is because there's a God who is above all else. And he created us. And he created us to be pointed towards himself. And anytime we are pointed towards something else, it leads us to dead ends. Is that working? And so for us, we have to say, how do we start with agreement? How do we expose then the dead end? And then how do we point to something greater and say, this has got to be bigger than this? That there is something that you have, and this is great for us because it is hopeful as we begin to point our lives to this. And it says this, from one man he made all of the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history. I want you to get this appointed times in history. And the boundaries of their lands. And God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us. For in him we live and we move and we have our being. And as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. So we point to the greatness of God. We point to this, and this comes back to this reality. It's saying from the very beginning, this story has God's fingerprints all over it. That we're saying this, that in all of this, God has his hand in every single part of your life, that you might not see God's hands, that you didn't arrive here on accident, that you may have believed that you're making all these decisions about your life, that you might have made these mistakes and you might have made these great choices. But the time and place that you're living is ultimately a part of God's plan. And you should believe that that is good news, that there is something bigger going on. From the very beginning, we've talked about this, that God's got it all rigged. And the beautiful thing in your life is when you begin to realize God's got it all rigged, that I'm not here in this place on accident, that I'm not in this context just because it just happened to work out, but maybe the hand of God has gotten me into this place, in this moment, in this time. And what that should do is to allow you to have a significantly decreased amount of worry in your life. Because don't you think that God has this under control? That whatever you think, if I don't, it won't. If I don't do this, then this won't happen. Behind all of that thought is a God who said, I've put you in this time and this place for a reason. And it says this, therefore, since we are God's offspring, should we not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill? In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, to change their mind. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. This is Jesus. He's talking about this reality. He's starting off with this idea of knowing what is right and wrong, being able to see into nature and see how you're created, what you're created for. And ultimately what he does is he drives towards the response, towards the resurrection. And saying this, that here's what Jesus has come to do, is to offer you through his life and death an opportunity to know God. And that resurrection means he has overcome sin and death, which means he has overcome everything that is broken by mankind, everything that is jacked up about our world, everything that is messed up. There is hope in Jesus Christ. And this is ultimately where he points them. It says this, but you have to make a decision. You can't just have this idea of Jesus and it transform your life. You have to say, I was pointed that direction towards these dead ends, and now I repent and go radically different. And so this, when they heard about the resurrection from the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council, and some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. This resurrection, it divides people. Is this really the case? And it should. There should be no middle ground. Either Jesus did this or he didn't. Either it's a bunch of fairy tales or it's something that's transformed the entire fabric of the world. And I'll just say, again, for those of you who are skeptics in this, how did a group of 120 people in a podunk town in the Middle East create something that has crossed the globe without this being the hand of God behind it? And if this is the hand of God behind it, and this same hand of God has orchestrated your life in this time, in this place, would not you be wise to begin to orient your life towards the God who is doing something bigger than you could ever do in your life? When you begin to think about how you could orient your life, I love this. See, when we begin to kind of walk this out, what happens is this, is they become followers of Paul and then they believe. What happens is that when we begin to draw our hearts towards God, it begins to have a difference in our lives. This is my desire for our church, is that people would say, that's a group of people that are a little bit different in a really good way. That I want to know why they have the hope that they have the community that they have the love that they have between them. And here's how people decide to follow Jesus. It's not necessarily because of good sermons. It's rare for that. It's not just because of someone having a conversation that says, hey, here's where it looks like. It's most likely because they see your life and they begin to say, that's what I want. I want something like that. That's how it happens. It says they became followers of Paul and then they believed. It says this, among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. And here's where we land this thing. The truth is, that Paul took a detour that he never meant to take. Paul went into a town and engaged people on their terms, winsomely, lovingly, came into this and explained the gospel in a way that made sense to them. And it forever changed at least two people's lives. Dionysius and Damaris. When we think about what does it mean for us to orient our lives to saying, hey, there's something bigger than me. In light of this, what do you think God may be asking you to do? And let me press just a little bit further and say this. Followers of Jesus have three options. See, either we're telling other people about the good news in a loving manner, or else maybe we don't understand the good news. We don't understand that this is really, all of the things are dead ends except for this. Or maybe it is that we believe that, but we just don't love other people very much. These are our three options. And what Paul does is he takes a detour out of his life, just the normal parts of his life, and he says, it breaks my heart that the people think that this is actually going to give them life. I've got to do something about it. And Dionysius and Damaris could have just gone on with their life and had another day at the Areopagus. But one day, this guy named Paul showed up. In the midst of people calling him a babbler, he told them about a new life in Christ. And they were transformed. Think about this, that Paul took a chance and it changed them forever. That God has put you in a time and place in history. And the truth is, the who's in your life will be far more important than the what's in your life. And here's what I mean about that. That for you to look around to the people around you and say, where is it that maybe there's a dead end that they're believing? That my life could intersect their life and be able to say, that's never going to get you there. That you keep going from girlfriend to girlfriend, boyfriend to boyfriend, that you keep going from job to job, that you kill yourself trying to be good enough at your job. You kill yourself trying to get grades that are good enough to get you into the place that you think will ultimately, if I just get there, right? That you think, how do I get this thing or this next vacation or whatever it is that you think is going to be that thing that gives you happiness. The who's in your life are going to be way more significant than the what's at the end. So when you begin to think about your life and the intersection of the people around you, could it be that God has put you into the place right now in your life and it has surrounded you with people that one day will say, hey, because this person just took a step of boldness, said that thing at the right time, was my friend through this, created a potentially awkward moment to be able to tell me that the pathway of my life was going radically awry. Could it be that God has surrounded you with opportunities to transform people's lives? And that one day in the future, people look back and say, hey, thank you. Thank you. There's a very old song that talks about this guy who goes to heaven. And around heaven, he finally gets to understand how many people his life's touched. And the phrase is this: thank you for giving to the Lord. I am a life that was changed. Thank you for giving to the Lord. I'm so glad you gave. And I just want you to think about this. How many lives can you touch? And could it be that God has put you into this time, into this place, and there's people around you who God has orchestrated because he's rigged everything, that if you'll just take a step of boldness, that you'll get to see how your life could be used for something significant. Over and over. I could go back and name those names. And my hope is that you would be able to tell people about the best news ever. And so that the intersection of their life could be able to have your name in the center of it.